When Mayor Maya, a black woman, is wrongfully arrested by Officer Jake Miller, a white policeman, the town of Lakeside is thrust into turmoil. What starts as a peaceful protest quickly escalates, exposing deep racial divides and putting the community on edge. As tensions rise, Maya must fight for justice while trying to bring her fractured town back together. Will Lakeside find a path to unity, or will the conflict tear it apart? Comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of justice, courage, and change. The town of Lakeside had a rhythm of its own. Nestled in the heart of America, it was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, where children ran freely down tree-lined streets, and where time moved just a little slower than the rest of the world. On a typical sunny day, the scene would look picturesque. Families gathering for picnics, shopkeepers setting up their stores, and the occasional laughter of kids riding their bikes. But beneath that peaceful exterior, the town had an undercurrent of tension, one that had existed long before Maya Johnson took the office of mayor. Maya, a tall and dignified black woman in her mid-30s, stood out in this predominantly white town. Her sharp eyes and determined posture revealed her inner strength, but the warmth she extended to others made her beloved by those who knew her well. Maya wasn't just any mayor, she was the first black mayor in Lakeside's history, and her election had been met with both celebration and silent resistance. Maya walked through the town square, nodding at familiar faces. Lucy Carter, her childhood friend, waved from behind the counter of the town's only library, where she worked as a librarian. They had known each other since grade school, but while Lucy, a white woman with an empathetic heart, had always supported Maya, their friendship had been tested many times over the years. Today, Lucy smiled brightly, reminding Maya that no matter what happened, she wasn't alone. The town itself had changed in many ways since Maya took office. She had implemented new programs for education, public safety reforms, and increased support for local businesses. But there was resistance, especially from the town's small but vocal police force. Chief among them was Officer Jake Miller, a stocky white man in his 40s with a rigid demeanor. To him, rules were rules, and anyone who broke them, no matter their status, had to pay. He believed in the letter of the law, but often let his own biases dictate how he enforced it. Jake Miller had been on the force for over a decade. Known for his rough edges, Jake prided himself on his no-nonsense attitude. He saw himself as the enforcer of law and order, but beneath that exterior there was an undercurrent of resentment, especially toward those who didn't fit into his narrow worldview. On the other hand, Evan Turner, a passionate community activist, had spent years advocating for racial justice and equality in Lakeside. He worked closely with Maya, rallying support from the town's black community and allies. His frustration with Lakeside's status quo was palpable, and he wasn't afraid to challenge the system. Tall and lean, with a voice that commanded attention, Evan often found himself at odds with Jake. Nathan Parker, a younger police officer who had recently moved to Lakeside, represented the opposite of Jake. Nathan, still in his 20s, was empathetic and wanted to do the right thing, though he was still figuring out what that meant in a town as complicated as Lakeside. Nathan admired Maya's leadership, but found it difficult to navigate the unspoken tension within the police force, especially with someone like Jake as a senior officer. It was a crisp, bright morning, and Maya's day started as usual. She loved mornings, the time of day when the world was still quiet and she could gather her thoughts before the rush of meetings and town affairs consumed her. After a brisk jog through the park, she headed toward the coffee spot, a local cafe owned by Joe and Emma Daniels, a middle-aged couple who had supported her campaign from the start. "Good morning, Mayor Johnson," Joe called out, tipping his hat. "Morning, Joe. How's business?" "Could be better, but we're hanging in there," he replied, serving up her usual black coffee, no sugar. As Maya took a sip of the steaming coffee, she felt a sense of pride. She had worked hard to build relationships in the town, and even though not everyone supported her, she knew she had made a difference. Her next stop was a meeting with local business owners, but first she planned to stop by the park to say hello to a group of volunteers working on a community garden. But as she crossed the street, something unexpected happened. She heard the sharp screech of tires behind her, followed by a voice that made her heart skip a beat. "Hey, stop right there!" It was Officer Jake Miller. Maya turned to see Jake stepping out of his patrol car, his hand on his belt as if he was ready to issue a citation. His posture was aggressive, and his eyes were narrowed. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Maya asked calmly, though she could feel her stomach tight. "You just crossed on a red light," Jake said, his voice low and authoritative. "I don't think that's right," Maya replied, frowning slightly. "I saw the light. It was green." Jake took a step closer, towering over her. "Doesn't matter what you think. You broke the law." For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. Maya was no stranger to confrontations like this. She had faced subtle and overt discrimination throughout her life, but this was different. She wasn't just Maya Johnson, a citizen of Lakeside. She was Maya Johnson, the mayor. And yet, none of that seemed to matter to Jake. Around them, the town's usual peaceful rhythm faltered. People were beginning to notice the exchange. A few passers-by stopped and stared, sensing that something wasn't right. Lakeside had long struggled with its racial dynamics. While outwardly peaceful, there were unspoken rules, lines that were rarely crossed but always understood. Maya had worked tirelessly to change that, implementing policies aimed at inclusion and equality. But as with many small towns, change came slowly, and resistance came swiftly. Jake represented that resistance. He saw the world in black and white, both figuratively and literally. To him, rules were set in stone, and it wasn't his job to question why or how they were made. It didn't help that many in the police force shared his mindset, making it harder for officers like Nathan to navigate the force with a sense of justice. Lucy, watching from a distance in the library, felt a familiar dread creep into her chest as she saw Maya's confrontation with Jake. She knew Maya could hold her own, but she also knew how fragile the peace in Lakeside really was. She sent a quick text to Maya. "Everything okay?" Maya didn't respond. Across town, Evan Turner was wrapping up a meeting with some local activists. They had been planning a peaceful demonstration to address the ongoing tension between the police force and the black community. But he could feel in his gut that something was coming. The air had been thick with unspoken conflict for weeks. As Maya stood there facing Jake, she knew that this wasn't just about a traffic light. This was about something much deeper. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let this man intimidate her. But as she looked into Jake's eyes, she realized he wasn't seeing her as a person. He was seeing her as something else, something that threatened his authority and the way things had always been. Maya straightened her back. "Officer Miller, I'm the mayor of this town. If you have an issue with how I crossed the street, we can discuss it civilly, but I didn't break any laws." Jake's face hardened. "I don't care who you are, rules are rules." He reached for his handcuffs, and with that motion, Maya's world shifted. The peaceful rhythm of Lakeside had been interrupted. Maya stood her ground, even as she felt the weight of the moment bearing down on her. Officer Jake Miller's hand hovered over his handcuffs, the gesture clearly meant to intimidate her. The sharp sound of his voice, the rigidity in his posture, it all pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't about a traffic violation. It was about power. It was about race. And in that moment, Maya understood exactly where she stood. A crowd had begun to gather, people peeking out of shops and others stopping in their tracks to witness the scene. They recognized Maya not just as their mayor but as a symbol of progress in a town that had long been slow to embrace it. Her rise to office had been hard fought, and this confrontation felt like a test of all she had worked for. "Officer Miller, I'm telling you, I didn't cross on a red light. You're mistaken." Maya's voice was steady, but inside, her mind raced. How far would Jake take this? Jake's jaw clenched. "I'm not mistaken, Mayor," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he emphasized her title. "The law is the law, and I'm here to enforce it." Maya took a deep breath. She knew this had the potential to escalate, and she had to make a choice. Should she de-escalate and walk away? Or should she stand firm and defend herself, as she had defended so many others in her role as mayor? The watching crowd made the decision for her. "You know who I am, Jake," she said, her voice low but resolute. "We both know this isn't about a red light." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Jake's face flushed with anger. He took a step closer to Maya, invading her personal space. "You people think you can get away with anything because you're in charge now, huh?" He spat, his voice barely a whisper. "Well, not on my watch." The comment hit Maya like a slap to the face. She could feel the weight of the words, the venom in them, and she knew everyone else could feel it too. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a public display of the systemic racism she had fought against her entire life. From the crowd, a voice called out, "Leave her alone." She didn't do anything. It was Lucy, pushing through the gathering bystanders, her face tight with worry. Maya raised her hand slightly, motioning for Lucy to stop. She didn't want this to become a bigger scene, but she knew it was already too late. All eyes were on her now. She could feel the tension rising, the air growing thick with the potential for chaos. "Jake, you're making a mistake," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. "We can handle this professionally, or we can make a spectacle, but I'm not going to let you treat me like a criminal when I've done nothing wrong." Jake smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching as if he found her words amusing. "You think your title protects you? You're just like everyone else." And with that, he pulled out the handcuffs, clicking them open with an ominous clatter. The sound of the handcuffs opening sent a wave of unease through the crowd. People began whispering, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Maya took a step back, her mind reeling. Jake's actions were reckless, but more than that, they were dangerous. He wasn't just arresting the mayor, he was sending a message, and it was one she couldn't ignore. "Jake, I'm telling you again, I did nothing wrong," Maya said, her voice growing sharper. "You can't arrest me for something I didn't do." But Jake was beyond reasoning. His pride, his biases, and the need to assert control had taken over. He reached for her wrist. "Stop!" a man in the crowd shouted. It was Evan Turner, the activist who had been pushing for reform alongside Maya. He moved quickly through the throng of people, his tall frame standing out. "You're out of line, Jake. You can't arrest her." Jake paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Evan. "Back off, Turner. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Evan shot back. "You're not above the law. Neither of you are." A few others in the crowd began to shout in agreement. The energy in the air shifted from passive concern to active outrage. People were fed up with the subtle racism, the unchecked power of the police, and the constant feeling that no matter how far they'd come, they were always at risk of being dragged backward. Jake's eyes flickered with something that looked like fear, but it was quickly masked by anger. He grabbed Maya's wrist roughly and snapped the handcuffs onto her, pulling her toward his patrol car. The moment the cuffs clicked around Maya's wrists, a collective gasp went up from the crowd. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a public humiliation, a display of power meant to remind everyone watching that the system was still stacked against them. "This is wrong," a woman cried out from the crowd. "She's our mayor. She's done nothing wrong." Maya, now restrained, could feel her heart racing. This wasn't about the law anymore. It was about making an example of her. And as much as she wanted to fight, to pull away from Jake and stand her ground, she knew that any sudden move could escalate the situation even further. She had to stay calm, had to remain in control. "Jake, let her go," another voice called out. Nathan Parker, the young officer, appeared on the scene, his face tight with worry. He had been driving through the area when he saw the commotion and immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. Nathan respected Maya. He had seen firsthand how she had worked to improve the town, and this felt all wrong. "Jake, what are you doing?" Nathan asked, stepping between the patrol car and the crowd. "This is the mayor, you can't just—" "I can and I will," Jake snapped, cutting Nathan off. "Stay out of this, rookie. You don't know how things work around here." Nathan's jaw tightened. He didn't want to undermine a senior officer, but this was wrong, and he knew it. The people in the crowd were getting angrier by the second, their voices rising in protest. "You need to back off, Jake," Nathan said, his voice calm but firm. "You're making things worse." Jake's face turned red with fury, but before he could respond, the crowd erupted. People were yelling, holding up their phones and recording the entire event. It was quickly becoming something much bigger than a simple arrest. It was becoming a movement, and Maya was at the center of it. Within minutes, footage of the arrest was uploaded to social media. The hashtags #JusticeForMaya and #LakesideInjustice began trending. People from neighboring towns started to arrive, swelling the ranks of those already gathered. What had started as a confrontation between a mayor and a police officer had now turned into a national story. Maya, sitting in the back of Jake's patrol car with her hands cuffed behind her, could see the crowd growing larger through the window. The sound of chants filled the air, demanding justice, demanding her release. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. This wasn't how she had envisioned her day, but now she was in the thick of something much bigger than herself. "This isn't going away, Jake," Nathan warned, stepping closer to the car. "You need to let her go. This could destroy everything." Jake glanced at the crowd, his face betraying a hint of uncertainty, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "I don't care," he muttered. "I'm doing my job." But Maya knew better. She could feel it in the air. The crowd was growing restless, and this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the years of pent-up frustration, about the way people of color had been treated in towns like Lakeside. And now, they have a symbol, a moment to rally around. Maya took a deep breath and leaned back in her seat. The fight had just begun. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Maya's wrists as she sat in the back of the patrol car, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the voices of the growing crowd outside, the chants of "Justice for Maya" growing louder by the minute. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, she had been jogging through town, preparing for a day of meetings and community work. Now she was in the middle of a confrontation that threatened to tear Lakeside apart. She looked out through the window at the scene unfolding before her. A sea of faces, some familiar, some not, had gathered in solidarity. She could see Lucy Carter, her childhood friend, standing near the front, her expression a mix of fear and defiance. Evan Turner, the activist who had been fighting for justice alongside her, was there too, leading chants and urging the crowd to remain peaceful. But amidst the shouts of support, Maya could feel the undercurrent of tension, a growing unease that threatened to spill over into something much more dangerous. Inside the car, Maya took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had spent her life fighting for justice and equality, but now she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person of color who had been stopped, harassed, or humiliated for no reason other than the color of their skin. She glanced up as Officer Jake Miller slammed the car door, his expression hard and unyielding. He had won this round, but Maya knew the fight was far from over. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. On the other side of the police line, Nathan Parker stood uneasily, watching the crowd and the rising tension with growing concern. The situation was getting out of control, and he knew it. He had joined the force with the belief that he could make a difference, that he could help protect and serve his community. But watching Jake escalate the situation with Maya, Nathan felt a deep sense of unease. His instincts told him that this was wrong. Maya hadn't broken any laws, and yet here she was, handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, treated like a criminal in front of the entire town. The more he watched, the more he realized that this wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about power, about Jake flexing his authority in the face of a black woman who had dared to challenge the status quo. Nathan glanced over at Jake, who was barking orders to the crowd, his hand resting on his taser. The tension in the air was thick, and Nathan could feel it mounting with each passing second. People were angry, and rightfully so. Maya's arrest had sparked something bigger, something that couldn't be contained by the police. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Jake, we need to let her go. This is getting out of hand." Jake turned to him, his face contorted with anger. "Stay out of this, Parker. You're new here. You don't know how things work." Nathan's jaw tightened. "I know enough to see that this isn't right." For a moment, the two officers locked eyes, the tension between them palpable. Jake's authority, his need to maintain control, clashed with Nathan's sense of justice, but before the argument could escalate further, a voice from the crowd cut through the noise. "Let her go," Evan Turner shouted, his voice carrying over the din of the growing crowd. The people gathered around him had been watching in stunned silence, their phones recording every second of the confrontation, but now Evan's call to action ignited something in them. "Let her go." The crowd began to chant, their voices growing louder and more forceful with each repetition. Evan stepped forward, his face set with determination. "This is about more than just Maya," he called out, addressing the people around him. "This is about every black person in this town who's ever been harassed, who's ever been stopped, who's ever been treated like they don't belong. We can't stand for this anymore." His words hit home. Faces in the crowd hardened, anger simmering just beneath the surface. People were fed up, and Evan's words gave voice to the frustrations they had been carrying for years. Maya watched from the car as Evan rallied the crowd, her heart swelling with both pride and fear. Pride, because Evan's words reflected the very fight she had dedicated her life to, but fear, because she knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. Suddenly, the sound of sirens cut through the air, and Maya's heart sank as she saw more police cars arriving. Officers from neighboring precincts, called in as backup, began to surround the area, their faces set in grim determination. Maya's stomach churned. This was exactly what she had feared. More officers meant more chances for things to go wrong, more chances for violence to erupt. She had seen it happen in other towns. Peaceful protests turned into battlegrounds because of a few wrong moves. The crowd, too, seemed to sense the shift in the air. What had started as a peaceful protest was teetering on the edge of something far more dangerous. The tension between the police and the people was like a wire stretched taut, ready to snap at any moment. As the new officers moved in, Jake's chest puffed out, his posture more aggressive than before. He seemed emboldened by the arrival of reinforcements, his eyes gleaming with the knowledge that he had backup now. Nathan, watching the scene unfold, felt his unease grow. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The last thing Lakeside needed was more division, more violence. He had to do something. But what? It happened so fast that no one saw it coming. One moment the crowd was chanting, their voices growing louder and more forceful, and the next, Jake had his taser out, aimed directly at a young black man standing in front of the crowd. "Get back!" Jake shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. The young man raised his hands, his face a mixture of defiance and fear. "I'm not doing anything." But Jake's finger was already on the trigger, and before anyone could stop him, the taser fired. The young man collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing as the electricity surged through him. For a split second, there was silence, a stunned, horrified silence that hung in the air like a weight. Then, all hell broke loose. The crowd erupted in outrage, their anger boiling over into action. People surged forward, shouting and pushing, their hands raised in fists of protest. Some threw bottles or debris in the direction of the police, while others rushed to help the young man on the ground. "Stop!" Evan shouted, trying to calm the crowd, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. People were scared, and that fear had turned into anger. Maya banged her fists against the window of the patrol car, her heart racing. She couldn't see everything that was happening, but the sound of shouting and the sight of people pushing against the police was enough to tell her that things were spiraling out of control. Jake, his face red with fury, barked orders to the other officers. "Shut it down. Get them back." The officers responded by pushing into the crowd, using batons and riot shields to force people back. But the more they pushed, the harder the crowd resisted. It was like trying to stop a wave with a wall. The pressure kept building, and eventually the wall would break. Nathan, caught in the middle of the chaos, felt like he was suffocating. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He had joined the force to protect people, not to hurt them. But now, as he watched the crowd being beaten back, he realized just how broken the system really was. In the midst of the chaos, Maya's voice rose above the noise. "Stop, please stop!" Her voice cracked with desperation as she pounded against the window of the car. She could see the fear and anger in the eyes of the people outside, and she knew that if this continued, someone was going to get hurt, or worse. She turned to Jake, her voice pleading, "Jake, call them off. This is going to get someone killed." But Jake didn't seem to hear her. His face was set in stone, his eyes focused on the crowd like they were the enemy. In his mind, he was doing his job, maintaining order. But to Maya, it looked like something far worse. It looked like an attack on the very people he was supposed to protect. With a sinking feeling, Maya realized that she couldn't count on Jake to stop this. If anything, he seemed to be feeding off the chaos, using it to assert his authority. If things were going to change, it wouldn't be because of him, it would be because of the people. Evan was in the thick of the crowd, doing his best to keep things from getting worse, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave. The people were angry, and rightfully so. They had been pushed around, ignored, and dismissed for too long, and now they were pushing back. He saw the police advancing with their batons, their riot gear making them look more like an army than a group of officers meant to protect, and he knew that if this continued, someone would get hurt, maybe even killed. "We have to stay peaceful," Evan shouted, grabbing the arm of a man who was about to throw a bottle. "That's not the answer." The man hesitated, looking at Evan with a mix of anger and confusion. "Then what is? They're beating us down. What are we supposed to do?" Evan's chest tightened. He didn't have an easy answer. All he knew was that violence would only make things worse. But as the police continued to push into the crowd, as Jake continued to shout orders and tasers were fired, it became clear that peace was slipping through their fingers. The tension reached its breaking point when another officer shoved a young woman to the ground. The crowd, already on edge, erupted into a full-blown confrontation. People were shouting, pushing, and shoving against the line of officers, and the officers, overwhelmed and frightened, responded with force. Maya, still handcuffed in the patrol car, watched in horror as her town descended into chaos. She had spent years trying to bring people together, to build a bridge between the police and the community. And now it was all falling apart. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched the police lash out at the people they were supposed to protect. She had never felt so helpless, so powerless. But even as the violence unfolded before her, she knew that this moment was more than just about what was happening in Lakeside. It was a reflection of a larger struggle, one that was playing out in towns and cities across the country. And that struggle wasn't going to end with a few broken windows or arrests. It was going to take something much bigger. It was going to take change. The chaotic energy in Lakeside was palpable as night fell. The protest, now a full-blown confrontation, continued to swell in intensity. The crowd was no longer just a group of onlookers. They were protesters fighting against systemic oppression, their voices louder and more desperate with each passing minute. Maya sat in the back of the patrol car, her heart racing as she watched the scene unfold. The police were becoming more aggressive, pushing people back with batons and riot shields. Tear gas canisters were deployed, and clouds of smoke filled the air, stinging the eyes and throats of those in the crowd. People were coughing, some screaming, and the tension was reaching its breaking point. From where she sat, Maya could see Evan Turner moving through the crowd, his hands raised as he tried to de-escalate the situation. "Stay calm. Stay peaceful," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by shouts of anger and frustration. "Justice for Maya," someone yelled, and the crowd echoed the chant, their voices becoming a collective roar. The air was thick with tension, and Maya could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had fought so hard for this community, but now it felt like everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. Officer Jake Miller was at the center of the police line, his face set in grim determination. He had been waiting for this moment, for a chance to show that he was in control, that he held power. The crowd's anger only seemed to embolden him. He glanced at Nathan, who was standing near the back of the police line, his expression conflicted. Jake sneered, shaking his head. "You still think you can play both sides, Parker? This is what happens when you let them think they can run things." Nathan felt his stomach twist. He knew this was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. The violence, the tear gas, the way the police were treating the people of Lakeside as if they were enemies instead of citizens. But he didn't know how to stop it. He didn't know how to undo what had already been set in motion. Before Nathan could respond, the situation escalated even further. A group of protesters, frustrated by the police's aggressive tactics, began pushing back against the officers' riot shields. One man threw a plastic bottle that hit an officer on the shoulder, and that was all it took. Jake shouted an order and the police charged forward, batons swinging. The crowd scattered, some falling to the ground as the officers pushed through them. The air was filled with the sounds of shouting and the dull thud of batons hitting bodies. "Jake, stop!" Nathan shouted, stepping forward, but his voice was lost in chaos. Maya banged on the window of the patrol car, her voice hoarse from shouting. "Stop this! Jake, call them off!" But Jake was past the point of listening. He was caught up in adrenaline, in the need to assert his authority. To him, this wasn't about keeping the peace. It was about control. The clash between the police and the protesters escalated rapidly. What had begun as a peaceful demonstration had now turned into a battleground. People were running in all directions, trying to escape the tear gas and the swinging batons. Some fought back, but most were just trying to get away, their faces filled with fear and disbelief. Maya could feel the panic rising inside her. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had always believed in peaceful protest, in the power of dialogue and understanding, but now all she could see was violence and chaos, and it felt like the town was slipping into a dark, dangerous place. In the midst of it all, Lucy Carter rushed toward the patrol car, her face streaked with tears. She pounded on the window, trying to get Maya's attention. "Maya, we've got to get you out of here." Maya shook her head, her heart aching. "I can't leave, Lucy. I can't run away from this." "But they're going to hurt you," Lucy cried, her voice filled with desperation. "You can't stay here." Maya's resolve hardened. "I have to. This is my fight too." Lucy's shoulders sagged, but she nodded, understanding that Maya couldn't walk away, no matter how dangerous it became. As the violence raged on, Nathan found himself frozen, unable to move. The tear gas was thick in the air, and the screams of the crowd echoed in his ears. He looked around, seeing the fear in the faces of the protesters, the anger in the faces of the police officers, and he knew that things had gone too far. He watched as Jake barked orders, his voice cold and detached, as if the people in front of him weren't human beings but obstacles to be removed. It made Nathan sick to his stomach. He had to do something. He had to stop this. Taking a deep breath, Nathan stepped forward, pushing through the line of officers until he reached Jake. "This has to stop, Jake," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "This isn't right. You're going too far." Jake turned to him, his eyes blazing with fury. "Are you kidding me, Parker? These people are breaking the law and you're worried about them. They don't respect us. They don't respect the law." "They're human beings," Nathan shouted, his frustration boiling over. "They're our community. We're supposed to protect them, not beat them down." Jake's face twisted in disgust. "You don't understand how the world works, Parker. You've always been soft." But Nathan wasn't backing down. "I won't be part of this," he said, his voice steady now. "I won't stand by while you tear this town apart." For a moment, Jake looked like he was going to explode. His hands clenched into fists, and his jaw tightened. But then, without warning, he shoved Nathan aside and charged toward the crowd, taser in hand. Jake moved like a man possessed, his taser crackling in his hand as he pushed through the crowd. He was looking for someone, anyone, to take down, to prove that he was in control. His eyes landed on Evan Turner, who was standing near the front of the crowd, still trying to keep people calm. Without thinking, Jake raised his taser and fired. Evan saw the taser coming just in time to move, but the prongs still caught his arm, and he fell to the ground, writhing in pain. The crowd erupted in fury, surging toward Jake as he stood over Evan, his face twisted in rage. "Stay back," Jake shouted, but the crowd wasn't listening anymore. They had seen enough. The protesters, who had been trying so hard to remain peaceful, could no longer hold back their anger. They pushed forward, shouting and throwing whatever they could find, bottles, signs, anything to drive the police back. Maya watched from the patrol car, her heart sinking as she saw the violence escalating. This wasn't what she wanted. This wasn't the solution. But she understood why the crowd was angry, why they couldn't just stand by and let this happen. They were fighting for their lives. Jake, realizing that the situation was slipping out of his control, began to back away, his face pale with fear. He had underestimated the power of the people, and now he was paying the price. As the chaos swirled around her, Maya knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She banged on the window of the patrol car, shouting to be heard. "Let me out! I need to speak to them!" One of the officers hesitated for a moment before opening the door, helping her out of the car. Maya stood up, her wrists still cuffed, but her voice was strong and steady. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "Stop! This isn't the way!" The crowd hesitated, turning to look at her. Evan, still on the ground, looked up, his eyes filled with pain, but also hope. Lucy, standing nearby, nodded encouragingly. Maya raised her hands, her voice filled with emotion. "I know you're angry. I know you're scared. But this isn't the answer. We have to be better than this." The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on Maya. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their desperation for justice, and in that moment, she knew that she had to be the leader they needed. "We're not going to win this fight with violence," Maya said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're going to win it by standing together, by refusing to back down, but also by refusing to stoop to their level." Jake, standing a few feet away, sneered. "You think you can talk them down, Mayor?" They're animals. They don't listen to reason. Maya's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her voice calm. They're not animals, Jake. They're human beings, and they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, Nathan stepped forward, his voice firm. She's right, Jake. We're done here. Jake turned to Nathan, his face red with rage. What did you just say? I said we're done, Nathan repeated, his voice steady. This ends now. For a moment it looked like Jake might attack Nathan, but then something in his eyes changed. He realized that he had lost. The crowd, the town, even his own fellow officers were against him. And so, with a snarl, he turned and stormed away, pushing through the line of officers. As Jake disappeared into the distance, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. The police, seeing that their leader had left, began to lower their weapons, stepping back from the crowd. Maya, still standing with her hands cuffed, looked around at the faces of the crowd. They were tired, bruised, and scared, but they were also filled with hope. Evan slowly got to his feet, wincing from the pain in his arm. He looked at Maya and smiled weakly. You did it, he said, his voice hoarse. You stopped it. Maya shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. We did it. All of us. The crowd began to disperse, their anger replaced by a sense of relief. The fight wasn't over, but for now, at least, there was peace. As the night drew to a close, Maya stood in the quiet of her office, her body aching from the strain of the day. She had won a small victory, but the battle was far from over. Lakeside was still divided, and the scars from the protest would take a long time to heal. But for the first time in a long time, Maya felt hopeful. She had seen the power of the people, the strength that came from standing together. And she knew that as long as they kept fighting, they could change things. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth fighting for ever was. She looked out the window at the town below, the streets quiet and still, and in silence she made a promise to herself and to the people of Lakeside. They would fight for justice. They would fight for equality, and they would not stop until they had won. The streets of Lakeside were eerily quiet the next morning. The town, once filled with the comforting sounds of everyday life, now seemed weighed down by the events of the previous night. Windows were broken, debris littered the streets, and the air was heavy with the residual tension from the protest. Maya sat at her desk in her small office at City Hall, her body aching from the physical and emotional toll of the protest. Her wrists still stung from the handcuffs, a reminder of the humiliating arrest that had sparked the violence. She glanced at the stack of reports in front of her, damage assessments, legal briefs, and letters from concerned citizens. But her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Despite her best efforts to keep peace, the protest had turned violent, and now Lakeside was more divided than ever. The local news was plastered with images of the clashes between the police and the protesters, and social media was ablaze with debates, some praising her bravery and others accusing her of inciting violence. Maya sighed heavily, her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. She had been elected to bring positive change to Lakeside, to unite the town, but now it felt like everything she had worked for was crumbling around her. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Lucy Carter stepped into the office, her face pale and tired. She had been by Maya's side the entire time, offering her support, but Maya could see the strain on her friend's face. "Hey," Lucy said gently. "How are you holding up?" Maya managed a weak smile. "I've been better. What about you?" Lucy sat down across from her, her eyes filled with concern. "I'm worried about you, Maya, about all of this. It's not fair what they're doing to you. You didn't cause that violence, you were trying to stop it." Maya nodded, but the guilt still gnawed at her. I know, but I can't help feeling like I could have done more, or maybe something differently. Lucy reached across the desk, taking Maya's hand in hers. You did everything you could. You can't control what other people do. You can only lead by example, and that's exactly what you did. Maya squeezed Lucy's hand, grateful for her friend's unwavering support, but the doubt still lingered. The town was in turmoil, and it felt like it was only going to get worse. As the days passed, the rift between the people of Lakeside grew deeper. The protest had left the town split into two camps, those who supported Maya and believed in her vision of justice and equality, and those who stood with the police, believing that law and order were paramount, even if it meant using force. The local news station aired constant coverage of the fallout from the protest, with heated debates and interviews fueling the growing divide. Some residents called for Jake Miller to be held accountable for his actions, while others defended him, saying he was just doing his job. Tensions ran high, and it wasn't long before smaller protests and counter-protests began to erupt across town. On one side were the people demanding justice for Maya and the black community, and on the other were the townspeople who feared that change would threaten the town's way of life. Evan Turner, still recovering from his injuries during the protest, organized a peaceful march in support of police reform. We need to show them that we're not going anywhere, he told Maya over the phone. This town belongs to all of us, and we deserve to feel safe and respected. Maya admired Evan's courage, but she also worried about the growing anger she saw in some of the protesters. The peaceful march had the potential to turn into another violent confrontation, and the last thing she wanted was more bloodshed. On the other hand, a group of pro-police supporters led by Doug Harrison, a local business owner, organized their own rally. Doug had always been a vocal critic of Maya's policies, accusing her of being too lenient on crime and too focused on racial issues. "We're not going to let them tear this town apart," Doug said in an interview with the local news. "We support our police, and we support law and order. What happened during that protest wasn't about justice. It was about chaos." Maya watched the news coverage with a sinking feeling in her chest. It was becoming increasingly clear that the town was on the brink of another explosion, and she didn't know how to stop it. In the days following the protest, an official investigation into Jake Miller's actions was launched. The footage of him tasering Evan Turner had gone viral, sparking outrage not just in Lakeside, but across the state. Civil rights organizations and media outlets picked up the story, and pressure mounted for Jake to be held accountable. The local police department was in turmoil. Chief Howard, a man in his late 50s, was caught between protecting his officers and maintaining public trust. He had always been wary of Jake's heavy-handed tactics, but had never intervened, fearing backlash from the police union. Now he was being forced to confront the issue head-on. Jake had been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, but that hadn't stopped his supporters from rallying behind him. Signs reading "Support our police" and "Jake was right" popped up in windows across town, while others called for his immediate firing and criminal charges. Tensions within the police department were also at an all-time high. Officers were divided, with some defending Jake and others quietly agreeing with Nathan's stance that the situation had been mishandled. Nathan himself was torn, still struggling with his decision to stand up to Jake and the consequences that might follow. One evening, as Nathan sat at home, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Maya. "Thank you for what you did. I know it wasn't easy." Nathan stared at the message for a long time before replying, "I don't know if it was enough." As the tension in the town reached a fever pitch, Evan's march for justice was set to take place. Maya had mixed feelings about the event. While she supported the cause, she feared that any confrontation with the pro-police rally could reignite violence. On the day of the march, The atmosphere in Lakeside was tense. Hundreds of people gathered in the town square, holding signs and chanting for justice. Maya stood in front of Evan, her heart heavy as she looked out at the sea of faces. Across the square, Doug Harrison and his group of pro-police supporters were setting up their own rally. The two groups were separated by a thin line of police officers, but the hostility between them was palpable. Maya could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew that this march could either be a turning point for the town or the beginning of something much darker. As the march began, Maya and Evan led the crowd through the streets, their voices joining the chants for justice. "No justice, no peace," they shouted, their words echoing off the buildings. For a while it seemed like everything was going smoothly. The marchers were peaceful, and the pro-police rally stayed on the other side of the square. But as the marchers made their way back toward City Hall, the tension between the two groups began to escalate. A few angry words were exchanged between the protesters and the pro-police supporters. Then a bottle was thrown and all hell broke loose. The bottle shattered against the pavement, and in an instant, the fragile peace that had held the town together broke. Shouts erupted from both sides, and people began pushing and shoving, their anger boiling over once again. Maya felt a surge of panic as she watched the crowd descend into chaos. She and Evan tried to shout over the noise, urging people to remain calm, but their voices were lost in the melee. On the other side of the square, Doug Harrison was shouting at his group to hold their ground. "Don't let them push us around," he yelled, his face red with anger. The police, caught in the middle of the two groups, struggled to maintain control. Officer Nathan Parker, standing on the front lines, felt his heart race as the violence escalated. He had seen this before, how quickly things could spiral out of control, and he knew that if something wasn't done soon, people were going to get hurt. Without thinking, Nathan rushed toward the center of the chaos, pushing his way between the two groups. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice desperate. "This isn't the way!" But the crowd wasn't listening. Fists were flying, and people were being pushed to the ground. Nathan spotted Maya in the crowd, her face tight with fear, as she tried to calm the protesters. He made his way toward her, dodging a punch as he went. "Maya," he called out, reaching her just as another scuffle broke out nearby. "We have to stop this," Maya shouted, her voice hoarse from shouting. Nathan nodded, his mind racing. "I'll try to get them to stand down, but I need your help. We need to get these people to calm down before someone gets seriously hurt." Maya nodded, her heart pounding. She had been here before, caught in the middle of a battle between the police and the people. But this time, she wasn't going to let it end in violence. With Nathan by her side, Maya climbed onto a nearby bench, raising her hands in the air to get the crowd's attention. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "Stop! Listen to me!" Slowly, the crowd began to quiet down, their eyes turning to Maya as she stood above them. Her heart raced as she prepared to speak, knowing that this was her chance to turn the tide. "I know you're angry," she began, her voice strong but filled with emotion. "I know you're tired of being ignored, of being mistreated, of being made to feel like you don't matter. But this isn't the way." The crowd shifted, some looking at her with skepticism, others with hope. "We can't fight hate with more hate," Maya continued. "We have to be better than that. We have to stand together, not tear each other apart. We have to demand justice, but we have to do it in a way that shows our strength, our unity, our commitment to peace." She looked out at the faces of the crowd, seeing the pain, the frustration, and the exhaustion in their eyes. "I believe in you," she said softly. "I believe that we can change this town, that we can change this system. But we have to do it together. We have to stand for justice, for equality, for all of us." For a moment there was silence. Then slowly the crowd began to nod, their anger giving way to a sense of purpose. They began to chant again, but this time the tone was different, calmer, more focused. Justice for all, they shouted, their voices rising in unison. Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her as the tension in the air began to dissipate. The violence had stopped, but she knew that the battle was far from over. On the other side of the square, Doug Harrison and his group of pro-police supporters watched as the crowd began to calm down. Doug, his face still flushed with anger, looked like he was about to say something, but then he saw the look on Nathan's face. Nathan, standing in the middle of the square with Maya, met Doug's eyes and shook his head slightly, a silent plea for peace. Doug hesitated, then slowly nodded. He turned to his group and raised his hands. "Stand down," he said quietly. "Let's go." The pro-police supporters began to disperse, their energy deflated. The police officers, seeing the situation de-escalating, also began to lower their weapons and back away. For the first time in days, Lakeside was quiet. As the last of the protesters left the square, Maya and Nathan stood together, the weight of the day's events pressing down on them. The march had nearly ended in disaster, but thanks to their efforts, the town had been spared another night of violence. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Maya admitted, her voice tired. "I feel like every time we take a step forward, we get pushed 2 steps back." Nathan nodded, understanding her exhaustion. "It's not easy," he said softly, "but you're making a difference. You stopped them from tearing this town apart tonight." Maya looked out at the empty square, her heart heavy but hopeful. "I just want justice," she whispered, "for all of us." Nathan placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll get there. It's just going to take time." Maya nodded, her resolve hardening. She had come too far to give up now. Lakeside was worth fighting for, and she knew that the people standing with her were willing to fight for it too. The days following the second confrontation were filled with an eerie sense of calm in Lakeside. The streets were quiet again, but the tension was far from gone. People kept to themselves, avoiding eye contact in public spaces. Though the violence had been halted, the town still felt like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. Maya spent those days meeting with key community members, religious leaders, local business owners, and activists like Evan Turner, to find a way forward. The town had come to a turning point, and everyone could feel it. They had avoided a full-blown disaster, but the underlying issues still festered. Maya had also been meeting with the town's police chief, Chief Howard, trying to negotiate reforms within the police department. Chief Howard had remained largely quiet during the earlier protests, but now, with pressure mounting from the state government and civil rights organizations, he was forced to acknowledge that the department needed changes. But while Chief Howard seemed willing to cooperate, Maya knew that the biggest obstacle still loomed: Officer Jake Miller. As the investigation into Jake Miller's actions concluded, the district attorney's office decided to move forward with charges of excessive force. The trial was scheduled, and Lakeside braced for what was sure to be another divisive event. Jake had become something of a symbol for both sides of the argument. To his supporters, he represented the last line of defense for law and order, a man standing up to the chaos of social change. To his detractors, he was the embodiment of systemic racism and police brutality, a man who abused his power to uphold an unjust system. Maya found herself in the uncomfortable position of being thrust into the center of the debate once again. Though she had publicly denounced Jake's actions, she knew that his trial would only deepen the divide in the town. And no matter the outcome, the ripple effects will be felt for years. On the day the trial began, the courthouse was surrounded by protesters on both sides. On one side were supporters of Jake, holding signs that read, "Support our police," and "Defend Officer Miller." On the other side, a group of protesters, including Evan and members of Lakeside's black community, held signs demanding justice for the victims of police violence. Maya stood quietly in the background, watching as the two groups faced off outside the courthouse. She didn't want to be there, but as the mayor, she felt a responsibility to see this through. The trial was more than just about Jake. It was about the future of Lakeside, about whether the town could move forward or remain stuck in the past. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Jake sat at the defense table, his face hardened and impassive. Across the room, Evan sat with his lawyer, a young, passionate civil rights attorney named Dana Matthews. Dana had been pushing for police reform long before the protests, and now she saw this trial as a chance to make real change. The trial itself was a media spectacle, with news outlets from across the state covering every development. Testimonies from witnesses, including Nathan Parker, painted a picture of a man who had let his authority blind him to his duty to protect and serve. Maya herself was called to testify, her words measured but firm as she recounted the events of the protest. "I don't believe Officer Miller set out to hurt anyone," Maya said, her voice steady, "but the fact remains that his actions escalated into an already tense situation and people were hurt because of it." One of the most anticipated moments of the trial came when Nathan Parker was called to testify. Nathan had been the only officer to openly challenge Jake's actions during the protest, and his testimony was expected to carry significant weight. Nathan sat in the witness chair, his nerves apparent as he adjusted the microphone. He knew that his words would have consequences, not just for Jake, but for his own career. He had already been ostracized by some of his colleagues for standing up to Jake, and this testimony would likely seal his fate within the department. "Officer Parker," Dana Matthews began, her voice calm but direct, "can you describe what happened the night of the protest?" Nathan took a deep breath. "When I arrived at the scene, the crowd was peaceful, but the tension was high. Officer Miller was in charge of the response, and as the situation escalated, I could see that things were getting out of control." "And what actions did Officer Miller take that you believe were inappropriate?" "He used his taser on an unarmed protester, Evan Turner, even though there was no immediate threat to himself or others," Nathan said. His voice grew more confident as he spoke. "And after that, things just got worse. The crowd reacted to what they saw as an unjust use of force, and the situation spiraled from there." Dana nodded. "And did you try to intervene?" "I did," Nathan replied. "I told Officer Miller that we needed to de-escalate, that we were making things worse by using force. But he didn't listen. He was more focused on asserting control than on protecting people." Nathan's testimony sent a shockwave through the courtroom. While Jake's supporters outside the courthouse decried Nathan as a traitor, others praised him for his courage in speaking the truth. As Nathan stepped down from the witness stand, Maya caught his eye from the gallery. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. She knew how hard it had been for him to testify, and she respected him for standing up for what was right, even when it cost him personally. After days of testimony, the trial finally came to a close. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, and all of Lakeside held its breath, waiting for the verdict. Maya stood outside the courthouse with Evan and Lucy, their faces tense as they watched the crowds gather once again. The atmosphere was electric, with both sides bracing for the outcome. When the verdict was finally announced, a hush fell over the crowd. "Guilty," the foreman said, his voice steady. Jake Miller had been convicted of excessive use of force. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Cheers of victory from one side, cries of outrage from the other. Outside the courthouse, the crowd reacted similarly. Some people hugged each other in relief, while others shouted angrily, their faces red with fury. Maya stood in the middle of it all, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but the town was still fractured. As the crowd swelled with emotion, Maya realized that this was far from over. The trial had been a step forward, but Lakeside still had a long way to go before it could heal. In the weeks following the trial, Maya worked tirelessly to bring the town back together. She held town hall meetings, inviting people from both sides to come and share their thoughts, their fears, and their hopes for the future. At first, the meetings were tense, with people shouting over each other and refusing to listen. But slowly, things began to shift. The more people talked, the more they realized that they weren't as different as they thought. Both sides were scared of change, scared of losing their community, scared of the unknown. Maya stood at the center of these meetings, her presence a calming force as she navigated the difficult conversations. She listened to the concerns of the pro-police supporters, acknowledging their fears while also advocating for the necessary changes. "Reform doesn't mean we're abandoning our police," Maya said during one meeting. "It means we're making sure that they're better equipped to protect and serve everyone in our community. We can support our police and demand accountability at the same time." Slowly, the town began to heal. It wasn't easy, and there were still those who refused to engage, who clung to their anger and resentment. But Maya could see the small signs of progress, the conversations that were happening, the bridges that were being built. Nathan, despite the fallout from his testimony, remained on the force, though he knew his position was precarious. Some officers still didn't trust him, but others had come to see him as a leader, someone who could help guide the department through the necessary reforms. Evan continued his work as an activist, but he too had changed. The protest had scarred him, both physically and emotionally, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He worked closely with Maya, helping to draft new policies for the police department and advocating for more community involvement in local government. Months after the trial, the town of Lakeside began to feel like a different place. The scars from the protests and the trial were still there, but they had begun to heal. The community had come together in ways that Maya had once thought impossible. And while there was still much work to be done, progress was undeniable. One evening, as the sun set over the town, Maya stood in the town square, watching as a group of children played in the park. The tension that had once filled the air seemed to have lifted, replaced by a sense of quiet hope. Lucy joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. "You did it," Lucy said with a smile. "You really did it." Maya shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "We did it," she corrected. "All of us." As they stood together in the fading light, Maya felt a deep sense of peace wash over her. The road had been long and painful, but they had made it through. Lakeside had faced its darkest hour, and while the future was still uncertain, Maya knew that they were stronger for it. She took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill her lungs. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Lucy nodded. "Yeah, but it's a good beginning." Months later, the town of Lakeside looked very different. The police department had undergone significant reforms, including the creation of a civilian oversight board and new training programs focused on de-escalation and racial bias. Nathan Parker had been promoted to lieutenant, a testament to his integrity and leadership during the town's most difficult moments. Evan Turner had become a leading voice for justice in the state, using his platform to advocate for reforms not just in Lakeside, but in towns and cities across the country. His work, alongside Maya's leadership, had helped to create a movement that was spreading far beyond their small town. And Maya, she continued to serve as mayor, her heart full of pride for what they had accomplished. She had never imagined that her small town would become a symbol of change. But now, as she walked through the streets and saw the faces of the people she had fought for, she knew it had all been worth it. Lakeside wasn't perfect. It still had its challenges, its divisions, and its wounds. But it was healing. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the town was moving forward, together. As Maya stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out at the town she loved, she smiled. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had made it. And now, the future was theirs to shape. Thank you for watching this story. If you find this story inspiring or thought-provoking, please subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more stories like this one. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue sharing stories that matter. Don't forget to hit the like button and leave your thoughts in the comments below. What does justice mean to you? We want to hear your stories and perspectives. Stay tuned, and together, we can make a difference.